start recording. Let me get rid of that. All right. This particular module, some of you may already have noticed, I've already heard from a couple of you, includes some thinkers whose work is often described as impenetrable. Okay. One of them is the first one we're going to talk about, Walter Benjamin. I don't know if you remember from the first class meeting when I was talking about kind of my reluctance to teach pure philosophy classes and why I don't find it terribly interesting. And a lot of it is that one of the things we've seen historically with philosophy is how limited philosophical thinking is by the mechanical nature of language and the problematic nature of translating from one language to another, or of capturing accurately in any language any kind of complex thinking. Okay. It's why, for example, we saw the development of mathematical philosophy, the idea of they thought they found a language that had that elegance and precision. Two problems, at least, with that. One, no, they didn't. Two, no one but them can understand it. So the challenge here for us is to take these ideas of these various thinkers and try to make sense of them. Okay. But Benjamin in particular, Arendt is a little easier to grasp, but that doesn't mean easy. It means easier. And none of this stuff is necessarily easy, okay? But with Benjamin, there are a couple of challenges that we have, okay? And I remember running into this in graduate school. And I was loosely familiar with Walter Benjamin as one of a number of scholars in what was thought to be a certain area of thought. And at that time, I remember, in books like the one you have that were sort of anthologies of philosophical thinking, he was always kind of put off in the corner someplace, in the naughty step, because it was like, well, we're not quite sure what Walter is saying, but we know it's interesting. There are two challenges with him for us. One of them is the simple mechanical nature of language and the impenetrable nature of translation from one language to another. In this case, specifically from German to English. German, does anybody here speak German? Any of you speak German? Maybe a little bit. One of the things you know about German is it's full of these wonderfully long words, which aren't words, they're phrases that capture with astonishing precision certain kinds of ideas, if you understand German. And so German is a language that a lot of people have argued is peculiarly suited to certain kinds of philosophy, because it's got this interesting sort of evolutionary structure to a word where it's like, oh, this is the thing that does this when this is the case, assuming this. And it looks like a word, but it's not. Okay, it's actually a phrase of meaning. We don't have that in English. And so a number of people have really struggled to give sort of good faith translations of Benjamin's work, which brings us to the second problem. What the hell is he really saying? And there, as I say, he was, where I first realized I shouldn't worry about this anymore was in a graduate seminar, because the professor teaching the seminar was honest enough to admit, I'm not sure what this guy's saying. It could be, I could understand him this way, or I could understand him this way. I came to two conclusions on that very hot afternoon in Davis, California. One of them was that I needed to think about selling my motorcycle and getting a car. The other one was I didn't need to worry about Walter Benjamin. Okay. If I had a professor who was supposed to be teaching this stuff at the PhD level who wasn't sure what this guy was saying, I probably didn't need to worry about it. But there are some concepts that he's dealing with that, even if we're conceding that we might be misunderstanding how he applies those concepts, I think the concepts themselves are worthwhile. And I want to get your feedback on this. I also am a little concerned that despite their good faith effort, the authors were not terribly effective themselves at demystifying or translating Benjamin. Is that just my impression, or did any of you struggle with that?
I kind of struggled with his notion of Masonic time or Messianic time. That part was
Yeah.
kind of like a little, I'm like, I could use a little more clarity on this. Like I kind of understood the divine violence aspect. Like I feel like that was kind of well explained, or at least well explained enough to where I grasped it. But the Messianic time part, I wish they spent a little more time
Well,
on
with
personally.
respect to understanding divine violence, well done, because I'm not sure, really, in good faith, that I actually do, such that I'd ever want to apply that concept. One of the people, oddly enough, with respect to that, who appears to be struggling with it a bit, is someone who actually knew Benjamin well, and that's Hannah Arendt. Okay, because in her work, when she invokes him, which she very seldom does, and it's almost always by allusion, it's not like direct citation. She talks a lot about Sorel, and not very flattering terms. She talks a lot about Frantz Fanon in not very flattering terms. Um, but one of the things, yeah, the notion of sort of the messianism part of that brings us to the second part of what's most challenging about him, is that his thinking is very much informed by mysticism. Okay. And I mean, we're going beyond merely metaphysics into this realm of what many people would consider to be unknowable. He was very close friends with a couple of people who were very profound scholars of the Jewish Kabbalah. And the thing about Kabbalistic analysis is that was some of the Kabbalistic theories and teachings are in fact encoded. Okay, they're not intended to be understood by it. They're intentionally mystified. Okay, they're sort of secret knowledge. So he was very much influenced by that, and there's a lot of that. That's where some of the messianism, I think, comes from. Is his that part of him that both is inspired by, you know, by Judaism and also by Catholicism. He had an interesting relationship with Catholicism, but also by this Jewish mysticism of the Kabbalah and these really esoteric scholars. It's very, very hard to just pick him up, read him, and walk away thinking, yeah, I get this. By comparison, for me, Marx is a comic book. It's that easy to understand. And Marx is complex, don't get me wrong. So if you're a little baffled by this, I think that's okay. But let's see if we can't identify a couple of things that he is pretty clear on up to a point. All right. The first is this distinction that he makes in law. He talks a lot about law and the inherent violence of law. Okay. And he starts out with this distinction between natural and positive law. Okay. Does that sound familiar at all? When he's talking about natural law and positive law, he didn't develop that concept, right? I mean, John Locke talks about natural law. But what does he mean by positive law?
Is that like the law preserving violence aspect of it? Or
Well, it
no?
does do that, but that's not what makes it positive law. What's natural law?
It's like humans in a state of like natural law, like unrestrained by the state itself, right?
Yeah, it's a stateless society within which there still is a core governing principle or guideline. And for Locke, that guideline, of course, is reason, right? So the idea of natural law is that as a natural state of our existence as human beings, we're endowed with a certain capacity to guide and order our actions, and therefore to interact with others in something other than a completely competitive and hostile way. That there is a natural governing principle. And again, for Locke, that's reason. So that's natural law. That's the source ostensibly of so-called natural rights. Okay. But positive law, generally speaking, refers to law that is made by the state. That is, it's law it's a fabrication. It's a creation of something, rather than the the simple state of being in nature. It's an artifact created within a juridically bounded society. A legislature meets, debates, and passes positive law. Okay, that's kind of what he means. And it's an important distinction, okay? So that, for example, when he talks about violence and law, that throws a lot of people when he says that violence essentially is intrinsic to all law. Okay. Can you think of how he proves that? He talks about lawmaking, and he talks about law preserving, right? What's he talking about there? Lawmaking and law preserving. These are, by the way, for him, different kinds of violence.
Right. Well, like, in my opinion, like I've noticed that he seems to, I mean, I guess a lot of authors kind of do it, but he seems to definitely say violence is, or imply that violence is power. And so I feel like it's the power used to preserve the law that you made. Is that, I mean, it kind of seems like self-explanatory.
That
So
would
maybe
be
that's
law
not exactly the way
preserving.
that he's saying.
Right.
Right.
That would be law. But what's law making violence?
Is that
How does
just
the act
like
of making
literally
law?
coercing others into like
Yeah.
enacting legislation? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much
Okay.
what he's talking about. So it really begs the question, when he's talking about violence, what does he mean by violence? This is the thing that a lot of people bounce off of with people like Benjamin. When he says violence, what's he talking about? Is he just talking about physical manifestations of force? Or is he talking about things like coercion?
Well, he's talking definitely about things like coercion, because he also goes into like the divine aspect of like education, being able to like break down boundaries and such like that, right? So it's kind of just, it seems, in my opinion, it seems like really originating in power, just the power to compel and such.
What about that? Does that make sense? In other words, when he says violence, should we translate that as power? Is he using those terms interchangeably? If in fact that's what Johanna means.
That is what I mean. Yeah, because it just seems like he doesn't, I don't feel like he actually uses that term power, but like that's kind of my takeaway, was that's kind of the one thing that kind of links all of this stuff, because even education is power, right? Or you can make the argument that it is anyway.
Well, one of the things that he does, for example, is when he gets into what is obviously violence, it's easy for us to understand as violence. He talks about war. Okay. But he talks about war as an example of law-making violence. War.
He says true war, right?
Right.
Right. That was another like part that also kind of like threw me off a little bit. Because that's when it started to, if I remember correctly, started getting into like the divine aspect of it, and that's where
Not
it
quite.
started to become like, no.
Not quite. Not quite. We can stop well short of his notion of divine violence, by the way, whatever that is. Okay. I mean, there's no consensus on exactly what he means by that. Is what I'm saying. I'm not trying to be facetious. I was just born that way. But for him, war is lawmaking, because part of what he's doing, remember, is and it's not clear that he intends to do this. He's assuming a kind of instrumentality to it by saying, well, what does war do? Or a kind of consequence of it. Let's not say instrumentality. The consequence of war ultimately is the making of new borders. You conquer a territory and thereby expand your own. Okay. So in that sense, since the making of borders is lawmaking, and it's done by, and it is by definition violent, that would be lawmaking violence. You can also look at it, though, as law preserving violence, because you are trying to preserve the juridical integrity of your own nation state in war. Okay. So simultaneously, war is both lawmaking and law preserving violence. Okay. That's an extreme example. Okay. Right. But he goes so far as to say that, I mean, I just want to make sure I'm saying this right. Does he say of law that it is a manifestation of violence? First of all,
I want to say yes.
yeah.
But okay.
Okay.
But I
But
feel like that's
here's,
an interpretation. Sorry.
yeah, no, and it's again, we're excavating here. We don't know what we're going to find. It's an archaeological dig in a mystical realm, all right, in another and stranger world. What he argues, in a sense, though, one school of thought is that what he's saying is that law is violent domination for its own sake. For the sake of dominating, you use law. So the law essentially is violence. Okay. And that ultimately then what he's doing is he seems to be suggesting that insofar as what we're talking about is politics, okay, it sounds like he's saying, could be saying, politics is violence. Because governing and politics, right, the environment of politics is domination and control. Now, one of the things we got to acknowledge is that Hannah Arendt completely rejects that. So a lot of people have then gone back and said, well, because in many ways their thinking overlaps, are we misreading him? Is he not saying that? You see, this is where he becomes problematic. So far, one of the things that we know that is generally agreed upon in when we get through the mystical haze of his verbiage and the bad translation from German to English, is that he views both lawmaking and law preserving as inherently violent. Okay? Where we would normally think of lawmaking and law preserving as political, he sees them as violent. But is that the same thing as saying, therefore, politics is violence? That's where the consensus breaks down a little bit. Okay?
Well, he does say it embeds it more deeply, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe there is kind of a separation. It's not necessarily that they're the same thing, but that it's making, so you have the ingredients, you made the bread, and now you have bread. It's like it's in there. I don't know.
Well, also, and apropos, a lot of what's going on in the country right now, and the grievances of a lot of people in the United States, he talks about police violence. Okay. But he doesn't talk about police violence as an aberration necessarily. He talks about it as a kind of a steady state condition of political life. When because for him, police violence it is law. Clearly, it's law preserving. Yeah, the action of the police and the violence they commit against those challenging law would be clearly law preserving. But he seems also to say that once the police are in the street, they become, in a very spontaneous sense, lawmakers. Because in the instant they decide, by the way they act or don't, they decide what will or will not be permitted. That, by definition, is law. Now, my sense is that's what he's trying to say, that simultaneously, police violence is law preserving and potentially and spontaneously law-making. Okay, if that's true, to the extent, let's say that that's true, I'm trying to sort of see if there's anything in that thinking that we can apply to what we're looking at in the States right now. Okay, you could argue that the difficulty of prosecuting violent police action, right, is separating out the law preserving from the law making element of that. The police are not supposed to have the power to make law. The legislature is only supposed to be empowered to do that. But what Benjamin seems to suggest is no, the state, in the form of police violence, can spontaneously, functionally make law. Now, again, it isn't a question, I would be ridiculous to expect you just passively to agree with that. But if that's what he's saying, that's fairly powerful. Okay. In other words, he sounds a little bit initially like Max Weber, right? The idea that, well, yeah, of course, so the state is in the lawmaking capacity of the state and the law enforcing capacity of the state require a monopoly of coercive violence. Of course they do. That's the state by definition. But he seems to be trying to drill down deeper into the implications of that Weberian notion of the state by suggesting, to what extent can we really say, though, that the police are not spontaneously making law as they go along? When, for example, the police can decide we had to go in. Well, were you legally allowed to do that? Well, if you look at the way law is written, look at the latitude that's given to the police in the field. By the way, no, this is not commentary on the police. I'm sorry, John, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I wanted to make sure that it's not like, oh, there he goes, somebody else piling on the cops. That's another discussion. What I'm trying to do is talk about the implications of this kind of thinking, because, and you know, I'm going to stop there because, John, I inadvertently interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, I was just bringing up the tear gas like use that happened with cops, whereas like they felt, I mean, you know, you hear like conflicting reports and such, but it was like where it was like a lot of these police officers or the ones that were brought into the Portland protests were not trained in those types of situations, and so they kind of like were like, okay, well, fuck tear gas because they're coming at us, and it's like not necessarily something you're like, there should have been more hesitation there. So I was kind of using that to say like, you know, they were able to unilaterally make that decision because they felt it was necessary on the ground, whether or not justified or not. I have my own opinions, obviously, but you know, it just sounds kind of like that, where they were kind of allowed to make that kind of same decision. Whereas like if this was an army, that obviously would be more of an issue.
Well, what about that though? I mean, if you think about that, do the police have any more latitude spontaneously to make and justify those decisions than would a collective of civilians? You know, if I and my buddies decided at 2 a.m. that we didn't want the bar to close down because we're having a good fucking time and they want Bill to play one more set, you know, which once happened. We had a cop come in and tell us we had to shut down. They're like, we want to hear him play one more set. And finally it was like, the cop's like, he can play one more tune. But I mean, it was this thing of where we had to negotiate this with a very compliant police officer because most of us weren't hammered, you know, but we don't have that latitude, do we? Why don't we? This is important. Why don't we? But the state does, as embodied by the police.
Well, doesn't that go back to that same idea of like us, you know, allowing the state to kind of, or like giving up some of that power to the state so that it can maintain control or you know, the well-being of society and such, even though I don't really think that your specific scenario is necessarily conducive to the well-being of society. It could be argued that though.
But isn't this kind of, sorry.
No, because you know, rock music, like whatever, it's conducive to a positive society, but that's my own opinion.
Well, it is.
I disagree.
Of course it is. Goes without saying. And the stuff that,
but at the same time, that cop could have said, shut this shit down.
Absolutely. Right? Yeah. But what I'm saying is, functionally, he made law. He made a new law right then that said, you got 20 minutes. Okay, that wasn't what the law said. That's what he said. And he had the authority to do that. But we didn't. Okay, what I'm suggesting is that if in fact that is what Benjamin is saying, and I'm going to argue that it is just for purposes of this discussion, then that creates what I sometimes refer to as the Lockean dilemma, which is when we leave the state of nature, we surrender a lot of our sovereignty, much more so than I think Locke is honest about. Okay, that's a classic example of that. You know, in a state of nature, we would play until bikers showed up and told us to stop or they'd kill us. Okay, or until we played, you know, Born to Be Wild or something, some sort of biker anthem. All right, then we'd be allowed to live and probably not become barbecue. That would be okay. But beyond a certain point, one of the things Locke seems to ignore is the extent to which we give up one of the most important sources of sovereignty, which is that ability to make law, that we delegate that to others, and then we're bound by it. So we have to trust that they are negotiating and legislating in good faith, but we know that they don't do that. Okay, I'll come back to that in a second. Rachel, you had a question, and then Quinn, you had either a question or comment as well.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, going back to your like pondering a while about like whether the police have the authority to like make law, because like in your case he was like, oh no, you have an extra 20 minutes or whatever. But I feel like it's less so that like they're making laws because they can't necessarily, I mean, they do, but not legally, enforce things that aren't actual laws. And it's more so like actual laws or rules only have as much authority as the person who's enforcing it is willing to give it. So like if it's the police officer is like, well, this is a law, but I don't really want to enforce it, then the law is not valid in that moment. And like the
Well,
same
the law is always valid.
well, yes, it's valid, but in that moment, the enforcing agent is taking away some level of its authority by choosing not to enforce it.
I mean, understand, we've seen this in real time with people not enforcing mask mandates or doing so selectively, or the police saying, we're not going to prosecute those. We're not going to go into restaurants and compel people to put masks on. Or, you know, and if it's probably not so much in restaurants, it's technically that's private, but in a public space, we're not going to do that. Even though the law might say you have to, we're not going to do that. That's the police making law.
Yeah, and I think
you know, that's what Benjamin is saying.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, and I think it's like an interesting like thing to think about because I feel like, I mean, at least in my life, I can't think of another time in which so many police have like so openly said we're just not going to enforce that law. And so then it calls to question, to me at least, like, well, then what do we do in terms of like having checks on the police to make sure that they're actually doing like their job, because that is their job, is to enforce the law. And if they're just not going to do it, like, where do we go from there?
Well, this is the dilemma, at least interpreted one way. This is the dilemma that Benjamin poses for us. Quinn, what were you gonna say? Or were you not gonna say anything? Professor Youngs.
Sorry, my audio keeps cutting in and out. My internet is just a mess today.
Yeah, a couple of people have had trouble with it.
Let me move my hand. But my question was slightly off topic of what Rachel had been asking, but it was more about the leaving the state of nature affecting the sovereignty. And in some of my past classes, I've heard that interpretation of Locke used, but with the word autonomy. And so I was interested in your take on the difference between using those kind of words. Do you know what I mean? Like of leaving the state of nature, taking away autonomy versus taking away sovereignty. Because I think that the way you explained it, it makes a lot more sense to use that word. But then I've heard the autonomy thing thrown around before.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering whether that was a difference that you think is a difference of interpretation, or if it's a difference of like applying this specific, the violence aspect that we are looking at it through the lens of.
No, it's just that I'm better at this than other people.
I mean, I'll take that. Okay.
No, when I choose that word sovereignty carefully, because sovereignty does not imply complete autonomy. We misuse the word autonomy all the time. To be autonomous means to be completely self-actualized, and to have the capacity to act alone completely, autonomous of anything else. And again, it's a sliding scale. It's not an absolute condition. But I think that Locke's even arguing that in the state of nature, as a consequence of the diffidence we experience because of, you know, the potential of people putting themselves in a state of war with us, right? It's not about autonomy. It's not that we're atomized individuals. It's that we have a realm within which we can behave as sovereign citizens. That is where we can say, the law doesn't say I can't do this, therefore I can. Okay, that's not autonomy in the sense that, well, I just make up my own law. Because even in the state of nature, you're not completely autonomous, okay? You're sovereign under law, but the law is reason. That's why I use the word sovereign.
Okay, that actually really makes sense. Okay, because I had been trying to distinguish what you had meant, and that makes sense. Okay.
Well, I'm sorry that was confusing. I didn't mean
No, it's not. You weren't confusing. It was just my own other classes and previous knowledge of the reading was confusing me. So thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, and again, this is one of the things about philosophy. Again, I mentioned it on the first day. Language is the enemy here at times. But I've tried always to make that distinction because human beings, for one thing, the use of the word autonomous implies the kind of hyper-individualism that just simply does not function in the real world and is not valued in most of the rest of the world. You know, Americans are peculiar for the fixation, the obsession that we have with individualism and individual identity. I mean, when you start talking about identity politics, ultimately, that, not that you shouldn't, but that has implications for sovereignty masquerading as autonomy. That is, I can declare myself autonomously to be of whatever identity I choose. No, you can't. Because identity is also that, that by which you are perceived. That's an important component of your identity. That's why racism is not about the individual. Racism is a social construct. It's not about the individual. And so that's why I've always tried to argue that the more, to me, again, if you're going to translate Hughes into German, the more meaningful concept is sovereignty, self-governing, as opposed to completely self-actualized and independent. Okay, as I understand it. So that's a good observation. I wish I had clarified that earlier, but I'm glad you kind of called me out on that, because I'd like to make sure that I'm being clear. Yeah. Okay. What, if anything, what does Benjamin try to tell us about the notion of justice? Because remember, ultimately, one of the questions throughout this seminar is, under what circumstances is violence justified? Okay, so in order to do that, we not only have to think about what violence is, and he sort of helps us and sort of not, but we also have to think about what justice is, because if we don't understand what justice is, we don't know what is or is not justified. And this is where Johannes' earlier comments, particularly about the notion of sort of divine violence and things like that. This is where messianism comes into it too. He makes a distinction. He says categorically, right, that justice is not achieved through law. Domination is achieved through law. Control is achieved through law. You know why? Because that's what it's for. In other words, he seems to be saying law's not about justice. Okay, it's about control. Governing is not about justice. Governing is about control. He seems to be saying that. It also, by the way, is a proposition that is rejected fundamentally by Arendt. But we'll get there, okay? But he actually says God determines the justness of ends, okay? And he says, I had to actually write this down so I wouldn't forget. Fate imposed violence, right, determines the justification of means. So the idea is, the one is sort of fate. Well, we say it means this. See, what was the outcome? Well, it did this. Did it serve the state? Yes. Therefore, it's justified. And then there's this divine notion of justice, which is the only way that you can determine whether or not the end, the consequence of something, is justified. Because the danger of violence is the extent to which it continues to justify itself. The classic cliche in Vietnam was, we're going to destroy this village to save it. That's a classic example of violence simply being justified, even though clearly the original end of that violence was not supposed to be to destroy a civilian village. Okay, but that's where the phrase first emerged, destroy this village to save it. And that seems to me to be getting at the dilemma of violence as in terms of ends that Benjamin is concerned about. Okay, so he seems to be arguing, and then this is again the mystic in him, the messianic thinker, where he seems to be saying only God can decide that. Now that, for someone who in many ways seems to be such a secular thinker, he's not. And this is where, again, especially for people like me who are completely secular thinkers, I will be honest with you that my mind on first and second approach tends to bounce off of that. As soon as someone says God, I stumble because I don't know what they mean, except in the abstract, and the abstract doesn't get it for me. I like to be precise. It's not about rejecting it. It's literally about not understanding the meaning. What is meant by that? How can God determine the justness of an end? What's the process of achieving that? He doesn't explain that. But this is where he begins to talk about divine justice. And so divine violence. violence that is selfless, right? Violence that is admittedly unpredictable in terms of its outcomes. How many of you have noticed that a lot of these thinkers, once we get, down the road a little bit, in one way or another, will concede the problem with violence is the problem with any human endeavor. You can never be sure how it's going to end. And so it opens the question, well, then how do you justify it? If you can't be sure what the consequence of that violence is going to be, how can you justify it? Or can you? I'm asking you. If you don't know what the consequence of violence is going to be, how can you possibly justify it?
He definitely talks about like the criticism of like revolutionaries and that kind of idea of like, you can't, to your point, like predict the outcome of like that revolution to a T, right? And maybe that's part of the reason why he's a little ambiguous when it comes to like what God wants or whatever, is because it's kind of like tossing the dice, right? You don't really know what's actually going to happen. And maybe he doesn't, like maybe that's part of it. Like maybe he can't really quantify that either. So, or qualify that either. So I don't know, that's hard.
This is the challenge of his thinking. But one of the things that I've always found stimulating about trying to come at it, Rachel, I'll get you in 1 second, I'm not ignoring you, I promise, is the very ambiguity for me when I approach him compels me to want to take another look at it. I was that way with Marx for years. It's like, Karl, what are you saying, man? Either I have had too many beers or not enough. Let me think about this. The ambiguity, like you say, is about all human endeavors, but I feel like ultimately, sorry, I've got to open up the chat again if you're going to do that, which is fine. Let's see. Quinn says, I think that the ambiguity, like you say, is about all human endeavors, but I feel like ultimately, at least for me, is that it's about risk assessment. Let me hold that for a second, because Rachel, you're still waiting. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, I feel like specifically when you were talking about, like, can you justify violence if you don't know the outcomes? It reminded me of something that we talked about in, I think it was our presidency class last term, with Sean. And Quinn, help me if I butcher this, because I might be butchering it, but it was basically something along the lines of like, wouldn't it be, there was like some proposal to like, if the president wanted to activate like nuclear codes, it would require him to first like kill his staff.
And they put it in a random civilian's heart, and the president would have to stab him and remove the codes himself, so that you would have to do the sacrifice of the innocent and really have to come to terms with that consequence of your own actions by doing it yourself. Sorry, Rachel, to jump in.
I was butchering it. Thank you, Quinn. Yeah, that's what that's what it reminded me of, is like having legitimate understanding of the repercussions of your actions before engaging in violence.
That's a sort of ethical premise for the justification of violence, which is that because you have to make a certain sacrifice, a moral sacrifice, and the destruction of an innocent life is a moral sacrifice, right? I mean that in a very ritualistic way. It's like you're sacrificing it on the altar of morality, right? The idea that somehow that prepares you to make the larger sacrifice of the innocent. What it doesn't do, though, is reinforce the morality of the act. It simply doesn't. I mean, killing one innocent life is killing one innocent life. That's at the very least amoral. Killing 100 million innocent lives is more than 100 million times more amoral, because you're doing it. Okay, so this is the dilemma. Some of these thinkers would say, forget it, Bill, you can't justify that. Don't try, because you can't. And I'm going to suggest to you, Benjamin is one of those. When he says what law justified means, he talks about law justified means. That is the means of violence for lawmaking and law preserving. Okay, he refers to that in some, if you're wondering, he uses the term mythic violence. That's what he's talking about. Now, that seems weird that he would use the term mythic violence to talk about what he refers to as law-justified means. Okay, but he means that in the same thing that, remember, we encountered earlier, the mythic violence of the general strike and things like that. Remember Sorel and some of the other thinkers that we've already talked about? Okay, that's what he's talking about. But he says mythic violence can only be countered by divine violence. And that is essentially violence inspired by God and understanding somehow God's will. Now, he's not a fundamentalist. This is where a lot of people stumble on that. He's not saying, well, I heard God's voice and it told me to kill you, and so that's divinely justified violence. That's not what he's talking about. But the problem is, I don't know that anybody knows for sure exactly what he is talking about. But somehow there's this idea that, divine violence is that violence which is justified by God. How we come to know that, he's not really clear. It's sort of like Marx doesn't ever really describe communism, if you think about it. I mean, read Marx and try and find a coherent description of communism. What he's talking about are the contradictions of capitalism. And that's why I've always said that Marx is better understood as a critic of capitalism than he is as a communist. Okay. I'm not even convinced that Marx was a communist, really, honestly. I don't think it's relevant. But he gave us a fascinating critique of capitalism, a philosophical rather than economic critique, I would argue, of capitalism. Okay. So one thing he does say, though, is that if you want to stop law-justified means, that if you want to stop the violence that is the force of law, the only way you can do that is to destroy state power. Now, when he does that, what that sounds like to me is anarchism. Okay, we hear some of that in, like, some of the writings of Bakunin. We'll encounter Bakunin a little later, but when he talks about violence, it's clearly directed at state power, sort of fused with the power of concentrated capital at times, right? The notion, Proudhon's notion that property is theft. Okay, well, what makes that theft legal? The power of the state to control it, to protect it. A Lockean liberal insists upon the state's power to protect the unequal distribution of property. Ergo, property is theft, sanctioned by the state, controlled by the state, protected by the state. The purpose of entering into civil society is not the empowerment of the individual, but the sovereignty of capital. That would be like the Marxist or anarchist critique of capitalism. Okay, we're not there yet, but there are, one of the implications I'm going to suggest that we can extract is this idea that the ultimate implication might be the only way to stop this is to destroy the state. Again, that Weberian state that has the monopoly of coercive violence. Okay, now, what you make of this is up to you. I didn't make the decision to put it in the book. It was there. I thought a lot about having you skip that discussion. I thought, no, because I want you to read Hannah Arendt for reasons we're going to discuss. But let your minds play with it a little bit and see what you can extract from it. Colin, what's going on, man? You have your hand up.
Yeah, so I guess a lot of the question that I had was, he seems to kind of stress education, and I think he says at one point, like, correct historical education as a means of challenging state power. And that was something that kind of the first time that I've seen it kind of discussed in that way by anyone. Am I kind of getting that right?
One of the problems there that I've encountered in some of the essays about his work is the open question as to what he really means by education. And in that is he, for example, talking about what we think of as public education, because public education is a construct of the state. It seems to me somewhat paradoxical that something that is created and facilitated by the state could be used to overthrow the state. Certainly that wouldn't be consistent with a lot of other revolutionary theories, for example. So one of the problems there is the ambivalence or ambiguity about what exactly he means by education. And there, in some of his other writings, he talks about education in different terms, and he separates out different modalities, I guess, of education. And so I mean, I'm going to have to kind of punt on that one because I'm afraid of confusing more than revealing. I mean, I can feel myself doing, I've become more disciplined as I've gotten older, is going off into this wonderful cul-de-sac of theories of education, including his. But if I do that, it's going to be 40 minutes and I'm going to have blank stares. I'm just convinced of it. You know, in other words, we'll be talking less about violence and more about education. So I'm going to have to punt on that. But no, you are right that there is in his thinking a mechanism involving education. And
I
some
thought
of
he
you have already,
considered, sorry.
sorry, go ahead, because I was thinking of something you said earlier.
Well, because I was thinking, like, didn't he consider education to be violent in that it removes borders and such? Like, so the way I interpreted that anyway was that, you know, kind of the knowledge is power kind of thing. Because again, all of this kind of comes back to power, right? The power to change, the power to, I mean, maybe even critical thinking in some sense, where it's like you realize how manipulative the state is. And you couldn't technically take down a state in that kind of same way. That was my interpretation. Anyway.
Well, no, and I don't think you're wrong. And as I say, I mean, it's a rich discussion. If this were a theoretical discussion of the nature of education in civil society or something, you know, we could do that, because some of his writing does seem to suggest that there is power tantamount to violence in the empowerment of education, that the process of educating people gives them some escape velocity from the inertial drag of state control, or you have the potential to do that. So certainly he seems to be saying that. What I'm honestly not sure of, though, is where he ends up with that discussion. I'm not sure where to take it, you know, because it's been one of the parts of his thinking that hasn't interested me as much, because I don't find myself lighting up when I read that. I don't think, oh, I get that. Whereas when I read him on violence and when I read him on, I'm still fascinated with this notion of divine violence. I just don't think I've figured it out yet. And I've been thinking about this for way too long. I mean, how many decades have I been thinking about this guy? But that I understand is my own limitation, because I have no religious background. And I think it would probably help if I did have. I think I'm operating at a conceptual disadvantage. You know, I'm not a mystic and I'm not a religious thinker. I'm very secular in my thinking. Okay.
Neither am I, but I was actually going to add, like, I wonder though, if maybe that's connected to that messianic kind of point of view, where it's like we had, what was it? The present has a messianic power, like a weak messianic power over the past.
Yes.
And so I wonder if maybe, since education is, you know, in regards to like history, for example, and learning from it, that is related to education, maybe that's part of that weak link to the past that helps us shape the future that we're not supposedly connected to. I don't know.
No, I think it is.
Kind of.
Yeah, I think it is, because he does talk a lot about the continuity of generations, and that ultimately, you know, one of the things that people omit from their analysis of the present is that you are like sort of yesterday's potential, right? And so you are the actualization of what was conceptualized a generation or 5 generations earlier. And that, you know, he gets into that messianic discussion. The implication of that going forward is that you carry within you that sort of that anticipation of the messianic power of generations to come. And this is important if for no other reason than that it compels you to revisit the implications of the actions you take, and more specifically of the violence that occurs. And my understanding is he's using that, at least in part, as a justification for challenging the violence of lawmaking and law preserving. But again, you know, this is rare that I've found a thinker like this who simultaneously fascinates me, but about whom I draw so few conclusions. And then I come to find out, like, when I knew we were going to do this, right, I got on a Zoom call with a colleague of mine who was a political philosophy student when I was in graduate school. And right away, she bailed. She's like, I don't read the guy. I can't make sense of him. And she's like smarter than I am. So I'm like, okay, fine. Sherry doesn't dig this and I don't have to worry about it. But then I thought, yes, I do, because I have to teach it. But his theory of violence, I think, is as compelling for its unorthodoxy as it is for anything else. I mean, this is not Sorel. This is not, the wonder that is the general strike, which sounds like a kind of fantasy. Keep in mind that people like Sorel had initially this belief that the proletariat, right, needed to sort of goad the bourgeoisie into open conflict. There were a couple of thinkers like that was a good thing, and that you wouldn't have the ascension of the proletariat unless the bourgeoisie was angered by the violence of the proletariat into trying to respond with violence. That's a very provocative theory of political violence. Okay, it's one that's often overlooked in that work too. I think it's fair to say that Hannah Arendt makes fun of it, particularly in On Violence. But let's hold in abeyance this discussion on Benjamin, and I'd at least like to start. I don't know how far we're going to get. Remember, we got 3 weeks to do this. This stuff's going to take some time, because I don't know how many of you glanced ahead and started looking at Foucault, and you look at epistemic violence and things like that, and all of a sudden it's like, shit, what are we talking? Oh, of course, we're bringing the French in. Everything becomes ambiguous, and I feel like I should get Marianne Golding in here to explain it in French or something, because she clearly is going to understand it better than I am. But it's compelling. Okay. I want us to look just a little bit at Hannah Arendt, but I want first, and this may be as far as we get today with this, I don't feel rushed at all on this. I want to acknowledge that simultaneously, I'm very ambivalent about Hannah Arendt as a scholar, because her writings have been incredibly influential for me, and very very functional, very stimulating for me to read. On the other hand, there is no question that Hannah Arendt was a racist. Okay, when you read On Violence, okay, and by the way, it's a pamphlet essentially. Here's the dilemma for me for Hannah Arendt, is that on the one hand, she writes with incredible lucidity, okay, and a really penetrating insight into these. She makes more sense of her colleagues and her predecessors than almost anyone I've ever read. But then she also says these absolutely repellent things where I think, Hannah, what are you thinking? I mean, here is someone who was a Jew who experienced lifelong anti-Semitism, culminating in, Kristallnacht and the Nazi ascension, fled Nazi Germany, taking with her Benjamin's writings. He then took his own life because he couldn't get out. She did get out, lived as essentially stateless life for the rest of her life, smoked lots of cigarettes and philosophized a lot, and was very German. Has, in the universalist sense, an absolute repugnance for racism. And yet, when you look at her writings, particularly, she writes a lot on violence. She writes a lot about the student activism, which in the United States in particular, but also in Germany. But the student activism that is one of the things that inspired her to write this book, because her concern, by the time that I believe it was 1969, the first draft of this, her concern was people were invoking essentially non-violent thinkers like Marx, who had no comprehensive theory of violence, right? His idea was the inevitability of class struggle and the inevitability of the dialectical transformation from capitalism to socialism to communism, okay? That is, when he used the term dictatorship of the proletariat, that doesn't imply violence. That implies control of the means of production, okay? But here were these, so-called revolutionaries, American revolutionaries in particular. They're latching on to Marx and all these other dissident, some of the Frankfurt School people, and yet they're kind of any means necessary kind of thing. And that horrified her, okay? She was really unsettled by the idea that people would take transformative thinkers for all of their problems, and imbue them with an acknowledgement and even a justification of violence that cannot be found in their work. She also was very concerned about the degree to which the core writings of Fanon were being used to inform a lot of left-wing agitation, but also were being misread fundamentally. And like, if you look at, I think I have it right here. Wretched of the Earth was the one that everybody was reading. When you go to Wretched of the Earth, the first chapter of Wretched of the Earth, this is such an American thing, is called On Violence, okay? There's a whole bunch of other stuff that Fanon has to say after that, and she's saying, yeah, but nobody read it. They read Fanon on violence. They took him at his word, literally, without understanding the nuances and the levels of analysis on which he was developing his theory. And they used Fanon, she argues, either stupidly, right, or imperfectly, to justify violence for its own sake, as though arguing that Fanon was doing that, was declaring that violence is an end in itself, which he's not really saying. Okay, we're not to Fanon yet. On the other hand, let me see if I can't find this really quickly, then I will stop. But yeah, okay. How many of you are familiar with a guy by the name of James, excuse me, James Forman? And he wrote what was called, the short term of it was the Black Manifesto, circa 1969, which he delivered in front of, I can't remember the name, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the church now. And this was a manifesto. He was an African-American activist. He wrote this manifesto that, among other things, demanded of white Christian churches and Jewish synagogues reparations to Black America for the legacy of slavery and all that that implied, of $500 million. Okay. Well, let me see if I can get what she said. Let's see. Oh God, I hope I can find it. Shoot, I can't. Damn it. This isn't where. Okay, this is worth looking up. Bear with me. This will give you an idea of what disturbs me about her. If I can find it. I can't. Damn it.
Can I just ask real fast? I'm curious why he directed it towards religious institutions as opposed to.
Well, because he saw white religious institutions as providing the moral underpinnings to justify it. Not without some, validity as far as it goes. We know, for example, that, well into his lifetime, Christian churches in the segregated South were still using the Bible to justify, the inferior status of Black Americans. Okay. But here's the thing I was looking for. Maybe it's just as well that I fly over this because it'll piss you off with Hannah Arendt and then we won't be able to talk about her anymore. She's talking about student activism. She actually says, she compares the political motivations of white student activists with those of Black student activists, okay? And she says a few things that are really disturbing, but also monumentally ignorant, okay? One of the things she does clearly states, these are not ambiguous statements, right? Because she said them more than once, was that the motivations of the white student activists were reasonable and appropriate, right? They were legitimate. She referred to the motivations of Black activists, even at the same universities, as being essentially ludicrous and nonsensical, okay? And she argued that, first of all, they were demanding special treatment, even though they had been allowed into universities that had let them in, even though they didn't meet the qualifying standards for those universities. So she's demonizing affirmative action, first of all, okay? She's also arguing that they, as a cohort, right, that they lack the skills of the white students. Okay, I mean, you see where this is going, yeah? And it's like, holy shit, this is this person who hates racism, who's being a racist systematically and won't stop. You know, it's like when you're in a situation with a few people and somebody's a little bit fucked up and they start going off and they won't stop. And you're trying to find a way to signal to them, you are raising the hate quotient in this room. Please stop. And she won't do it. And she keeps doing it. And that's what she reminds me of. Like, for example, she hated Black Studies programs. She thought that they were worthless, that they were non-academic, that there was no intellectual substance or content to them. Now, again, we can critique Black Studies programs or whatever, Chicano Studies programs or any, Native American Studies, or we can critique those and we can discuss those. But she categorically dismisses them, saying, among other things, that Black students wanted to learn Kiswahili. Okay, well, first of all, they shouldn't. In that sense, it doesn't make sense because Kiswahili is a language that was never used in the parts of Africa from which almost all of those people are descended. So it is irrelevant to them in that. I get that, but she doesn't even know that. Okay, she dismisses it as a non-language. A relatively new non-language that's largely composed of Arab loanwords and was used by Arab slave traders in the Red Sea slave trade. Now, it was used by Arab slave traders in the Red Sea slave trade and in other trade, okay? There are Arab loanwords in it. About 20% of the language is Arab loanwords. How many loanwords, what percentage of English is loanwords? She doesn't stop to think that, okay? But also, that sounds almost Nazi in a way. It's shatteringly ignorant. We know that written Swahili goes back to the early 18th century, first decade of the 18th century. By that standard alone, it's not a new language. But we also know that as a Bantu language, it's at least centuries, if not millennia old. It is, like every language, an amalgam of other languages. It's a fusion of languages. She doesn't understand any of this. But as a practicing intellectual, she just barfs out this word salad that is fundamentally racist. Okay? And she doesn't stop there. She just doesn't stop there. She thinks that the whole discussion of reparations is nonsensical. Now, this is important. Even if you don't agree with reparations, the discussion can have value. What is the real legacy of slavery? How can that not be valuable? Unless you side now with the current Republican Party or that wing of the Republican Party that says, okay, no more critical race theory, no more notion. I mean, there's something good in slavery kind of stuff. That seems un-American. But also, never mind that, because that's okay. It seems irrational. But a lot of what she's saying seems irrational. It's not informed. A lot of it is factually incorrect. And yet, she's clearly brilliant. So it begs the question, why? Why would she continue? And she did. She writes reflections on Little Rock, and the desegregation of the school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And she clearly is absolutely tone deaf to what's happening there. When she describes Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, she just categorically refers to Africans as savages. They have no culture. Now, she uses the German word Kultur, okay? Kultur in German implies what we sometimes call high culture, right? Written literature, sophisticated language, and it's written down and there's a traceable record. By that standard, it's fair to say there's very little of that in pre-colonial sub-Saharan Africa. But it begs the question, what are you trying to say? Because they're not European, they're savage. Okay. Now, again, this is not someone writing in the 19th century. This is not someone writing to justify British colonialism or even German colonialism. This is someone who, by the way, could distinguish between bad colonialism and benevolent empire. Okay, and things like that. Oh, yeah, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just real quick question. So I made a joke about calipers, but she doesn't seem necessarily like a biological essentialist in terms of race relations, but more of a cultural.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, okay.
I think you're right. I mean, there is something about European intellectuals when they look at the non-European world. In other words, her idea when looking at, and she used at least twice that I've read the phrase dark continent, right? The idea for her was it wasn't a reference to the people. It was a reference to the absolute unknowable nature of what they had, because it in no way has any bearing on real human societies. She seems at various times to be animalizing, Africans. Her analysis is almost zoological. It really is. And that is a consequence of a certain view of imperialism that generally, in other words, you know how sometimes you get a thinker like that and you say, well, but we have to take them in the context of their time. Yes, Thomas Jefferson had slaves, but he also gave us the Declaration of Independence or whatever. That doesn't work with her. Because by the time she's writing on violence, where she's still doing this, all right, the Algerian Civil War is over. African countries are emerging as sovereign. All kinds of things are happening. By the time she's reflecting on Little Rock, right, the Algerian Civil War is underway. A lot of things are going on that she seems not to get it. She seems tone deaf. But we know, I would argue, that she has a hell of a lot to say. She wrote some brilliant things about totalitarianism. And she writes about the banality of evil and things like that when she sees Eichmann, and these kinds of, it's riveting stuff to read, On Violence has some just almost lyrical reflections on the nature of violence. And one of the things she rejects is the biological imperative of violence, right? She seems to reject that. That's important because most of the rest of our thinkers, I'm trying to bring this back around to violence, but most of the rest of our thinkers, you can see, they kind of assume, well, human beings are violent animals. Violence is an inextricable part of everything human beings do. We're just violent. We're dangerous, right? What she's arguing is,
sorry.
Hey, no, I'm sorry. Were you going to say something?
Nope, just forgot I was on mute.
Okay, that's okay. I do the same damn thing in meetings sometimes. Either that or I fall asleep. What I wanted to do before we got any further on this is I think it's important to discuss this, okay? I think there's a tremendous amount of value in what Hannah Arendt has to say, okay? It's not the same thing as looking for the little nuggets of truth in Mein Kampf, okay? That's not what we're talking about, okay? Or saying, well, the Klan had a few good points. That's not what we're talking about, okay? It's sort of like looking at the poetry of Rudyard Kipling, okay? Rudyard Kipling was an imperial poet. He was an absolute apologist for empire. But that does not gainsay the fact that his writing is often absolutely brilliant and that there's a lot of insight that you can get into the imperial mind from reading Kipling, okay? I want to say the same thing is true of reading Arendt, right? I understand a lot more the German intellectual tradition right after the Second World War from reading her than I ever did before. And that means in terms of its absolute genius, but also in terms of this Paleolithic reactionary spirit toward those people. It's all there in her writing. And so I'm going to suggest that while some of you may find repellent much of what she writes, and I may indeed agree with you, I'm going to argue there's a hell of a lot to learn there. So that's why I'm really comfortable kind of leaning into Hannah Arendt. I also think she has, of all the thinkers we've looked at so far, she has one of the most lucid theories of violence and politics, okay? And also one of the most distinct, okay? And so what I'm wondering, though, is we might have gone about as far as we can go today. We covered a lot of material today. You know, Benjamin, we're never going to recover from that. You know, we're going to be warped for the rest of our lives. We're trying to make sense of exactly what messianic, you know, whatever is and what divine violence is. But what I'd like you to do, and because looking at the notes, a number of you don't appear yet to have read Hannah Arendt. I would really prefer that you read the section on Arendt, and if you can find it, get a copy of On Violence. You might even be able to find a PDF of it online. Give that a read if you can find it, okay? Because you'll see what I'm talking about. In the meantime, when we pick up this discussion again, I'll try and have a few of those little nuggets that I was trying. I'm no good, if in case you've noticed, if any of you have had, you know, classes with me when we're brick and mortar, I never hold anything in my hands. I never have a book. I never have notes. I'm not really good at referring to notes and looking at things. If it's not in my head, it's not there. And so I tried to find stuff in the book, and, you know, I'm always conscious of time passing. And, oh my God, it's like this is taking minutes, when in fact it's 12 seconds, you know. But I don't want to bore you with it. But I really think that I first read On Violence as an undergraduate. And I'm not sure that I didn't read it even before I went to college, but first time I encountered it was in a development politics class as an undergraduate. And I thought it was absolutely brilliant. And then I got to these sections and thought, gee whiz, why are you saying that? You know, so it's like, okay, all right. You know, I mean, I always try to be non-judgmental when I encounter intellectuals. I just, you know, again, I think I mentioned this at the beginning of class. With me, it's never about whether or not I agree with them. It's always about whether or not I'm learning something from them. And I've learned a lot from reading Hannah Arendt. I really have. And I can say that about Marx, and I can say that about a lot of people with whom I really disagree. You know, my frustration is when I'm compelled to experience people from whom I can learn nothing. You know, I mean, I disagree profoundly with Plato on most things, but I've learned a lot from going through those texts. You know, I really have. And there's value there. So it's, I think really try and keep in mind, it's not important that you agree. The main thing is to what extent can you grasp what they're trying to say, and what can you do with it? Okay. I think I mentioned early on, you're not going to get a lot of answers in this class. It's about questions rather than answers. Because my biggest concern with classes like this is that people are going to think I'm telling them what to think, instead of encouraging them to want to think. It's the difference between Mein Kampf and On Violence, all right? She's not telling you what to think. She wants you to want to think. Hitler didn't want you to want to think. He wanted you to feel sorry for him and make him head German. You know, I'm not impressed at all, you know. All right, any questions? So, I mean, yeah, 1,200, yeah. But I mean, anything else where I could, am I leaving anything dangling that I need to kind of tie together before I let you go? Did you get anything out of this? I realize that this is dense as fog in some ways, but I think there's value in it if we can kind of slash through, you know, with the machetes here. Okay.
I guess I'm kind of looking forward to going back through what Benjamin had to say now that I kind of have a little bit more context on some things that were discussed in the class today.
Well, we're going to, you know, when we come in next time, if we want to back up and revisit some of Benjamin, we can certainly do that. It's just that I looked again at the notes before class, and I could see that most of you had not entered notes yet. That's usually an indication that you haven't had the chance to come to terms with the readings yet. That's okay. The only thing I'm concerned about is people who haven't done the notes, you know, for the first couple of modules. That's problematic, because that means you're not engaged at all. And I can't teach you if I can't engage you. But yeah, I mean, we can go back and have another go. One of the things you might want to do, there are some interesting things written about him, okay, that aren't written in quite the impenetrable prose that our authors sometimes use. Sometimes I think they're quite good. On balance, I think it's a good book. I do think they fall into that philosophical trap, though, of kind of messing around with language more than I care for. One of the things that I really like about Arendt's work is that she does that remarkably seldom. Maybe that's one of the reasons why a lot of her comments on race are so eyebrow raising, is because she's just categorical. You know, these people are stupid. So, oh, okay. All right, anything else? All right, so by next week, then you will have had a chance at least to go through these two readings. We'll take whatever time we need to get through this stuff. It's a bit of a slog. At this point, it's, we're halfway through the term. People are getting tired. A lot of you thinking about the summer. A lot of you might be getting ready to graduate. It's like, Bill, I don't give a shit anymore. Just get me out of here. I'm doing my best. Okay. But there's a lot here to vacuum up. There's a lot to think about. And I think it's useful. And also for those of you graduating, this is probably the last time you're going to get a chance to do this, where someone sitting next to you virtually or otherwise is actually going to care, so it's kind of cool. All right. So, again, it always seems funny to say this on a Thursday, but have a good weekend. Let's see. Let me very quickly. Yeah. Okay. That's good. I just wanted to make sure I'd covered something. I wrote it down. Be sure, Ann, and I did do that. Okay. Everybody who's here signed in. Is that right? Okay. Please do if you haven't, just because that way I've got an accurate. Thank you, John. I thought you already had, but that's good. That helps. All right. Otherwise, then I will see you next week. We'll have a little more discussion of Benjamin and Arendt, and then insofar as we have time, we'll move on to the scary French people. All right. I'll see you next week.